Good evening, everybody. My name is Nancy Easterling. It's my privilege to serve as Executive Director for Historic Sotterley, and we are so thrilled to be having our second event for this year's Sotterley Presents People and Perspectives. We are just so excited to have our speaker tonight. I'm going to let, in just a moment, our amazing Interpretive Programs Manager, Catherine Humphreys, introduce her for you. But when we found out about this, for those who are history geeks and love research, this will be an evening for you. Please, I see so many of you are doing it already. Please sign into the chat. Let us know where you are joining from tonight. And if those of you who are not as familiar with Webinar Jam, you'll notice when you go to the chat, there's both a chat and a Q&A button. If you have questions all throughout, don't wait. Go ahead and put your questions in at any time. And if you accidentally put them in the chat, we'll move them over to the Q&A for you. So don't worry. But we want this to be, we want to hear your questions. We look forward to that. But first, we want to get started with our speakers. So with no further ado, let me introduce Catherine Humphreys, our Interpretive Programs Manager, and she's going to introduce our amazing speaker for tonight.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight. As Nancy said, I'm Catherine Humphreys, and I'm proud to be the Interpretive Programs Manager here at Historic Sotterley. Last fall, our speaker reached out to me and asked an inquiry. Did the name Francis Irwin ring a bell? And of course, it did. But Francis's story is one that is often not included in detail within Historic Sotterley's research or tours. And so this was a history mystery to us. And we ask that as you listen to our speaker, Anna, tonight, present her research, think about it. Is this our Francis Irwin? Our speaker, Anna Carneal-Davis, is the Library Genealogy Associate at the Thomas Bouch Library, a local history and genealogy library located in Leesburg, Virginia. She earned her master's degree in applied history from George Mason University, very exciting, and her bachelor's at Longwood University. She has devoted over a decade of her life and her career to the public history field, working at historic sites, museums, and libraries. Her professional career enables her to explore a wide range of topics and deeply complex histories, and to help others in their identify records and on their genealogical journeys, and to find research that is best suited to their areas of interest. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome our speaker for tonight, Anna Carneal-Davis.
All right, thank you so much. That was a wonderful introduction. Like Catherine mentioned, I reached out to her a couple months ago. Let me go ahead and start this presentation. Basically asking her about Francis Irwin. And I'm really excited to share with you all the research I've conducted on him. He was an Irish convict servant and blacksmith who lived briefly at Sotterley almost 2 decades before the American Revolution. So this presentation will outline my methodology and how I utilize details from 2 runaway ads published 16 years apart to pinpoint records mapping Francis Irwin as he moves through England's convict transportation system. Okay. So as you can see here, I compiled all of my research and put it into an ArcGIS story map. And yes, as I move across the screen here, you can see you can scan this QR code to download that map. And so after this presentation, you're more than welcome to click through it and see the different resources I used as someone who's works at a librarian or as a librarian who works at a library. It's really important for me to make sure you all can access the same resources I used for this presentation. And as you can see, we're not just talking about the American colonies here. We are across the Atlantic Ocean as well. So buckle up. All right. So before we get into the research, a little background on me. I am, like Catherine mentioned, the Library Genealogy Associate at Thomas Balch Library. We are a history and genealogy library located in Loudoun County, Virginia. For those who are not familiar, we are the northernmost county in Virginia. We border Maryland and West Virginia, and we're about 50 miles or 50 minutes, northwest from DC. Okay. Loudoun was one of the first counties in Virginia to organize a local committee to commemorate the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. So one of the goals of this committee, and I'm the library liaison for it, is to not only research and commemorate those in Loudoun directly involved with the war and the revolution, but also those who might have not been involved, but certainly were impacted. For example, enslaved men, women, and children of African descent, women, indigenous peoples, and then, of course, indentured and convict servants from Britain and Ireland. So as a part of this committee, the research angle I took was on convict servants in Loudoun County. In exploring this new research territory for me, I had several questions I wanted to find an answer to. Okay, first, what kind of records are on convict servants, and what do they expose about a convict's identity? Is there a way to learn their religion, age, or nationality? What about their personality traits or their appearance? Was their service valuable in the 18th century Loudoun County? And as you'll see throughout this presentation, I hope I can answer some of these questions, okay? All right, now the system of convict servitude by the early 18th century was not a new practice for both England and the American colonies. So by 1718, the British government passed the Transportation Act to make the process more efficient. Crown-sanctioned merchants would take convicted felons ordered for transportation out of the jails and confine them to the hold of their ships, sail them across the Atlantic, and either sell them directly off the boat or hand them to an agent to sell once they reached their desired port of entry. These merchants were required to obtain a certificate to prove that the convicts reached the colonies. Okay, between 1700 and 1775, you can see approximately 52,000 criminals from the British Isles were shipped to the colonies as bound servants, and their term either lasted 7 or 14 years, depending on the severity of the crime. The majority of these convicts were sent to Maryland and Virginia due to a high demand for bound labor. So that bound labor included indentured servants and enslaved peoples. So for those who don't know the difference between an indentured servant and a convict servant, if you can see here, I kind of lay out a chart. Indentured servants voluntarily entered this agreement that's more popularly known. You know, they're paying their passage as they come over to the British colonies. They voluntarily want to be there, right? They're paying off their passage. So they had a little bit more freedom than your convicts. They were given freedom dues, clothing, and seeds at the end of their service. And depending on their age, and what the law required, terms usually lasted either 4 to 7 years. As you can see for convicts, they were convicted of a felony, so they were not voluntary, and they were ordered to be transported to the colonies and sold into an indenture. So an indenture is that quote unquote master-servant agreement. An indenture could also just mean agreement in general, okay? They did not get paid at the end of their term of labor, did not have as many freedoms as indentured servants, although a lot of the laws for indentured servants and convicts applied within the colonies, and their terms were more rigid, especially initially. So they lasted either 7 or 14 years. Okay. Now, as, again, someone who works at a library, I can't not talk about the resources. This list here is some of the more famous and comprehensive works on bound immigration to the American colonies. So you can see Peter Wilson Coldham is at the top. He's one of the more famous archivists from England. You can see his first book there, The Complete Book of Emigrants in Bondage, is him essentially going through repositories throughout England, Wales, Scotland, and Ireland, based on what the records allow. So mostly just in England, tracking those convicts through the court system and as they leave out, and port records and so on and so forth. Now, as you will see in my research, this is not such a complete book. And as repositories continue to organize their archives, things continue to be uncovered. So this book was published in 1988. So maybe it's time for a supplement. And I do know that Peter did publish a couple of supplements afterwards. Now, while I was searching through these indexes, because most of these are at Thomas Welch Library, I found that most of the published materials track convicts utilizing runaway ads. So by the time they were in the colonies, runaway ads were extremely prevalent in the 18th century American newspapers for the sole purpose of recapturing servants and enslaved African Americans seeking freedom from bondage. The ads needed to be highly detailed to allow for a speedy recapture. So another book I wanted to point out is this King Passengers to Maryland and Virginia. I found an entry for 2 ads that are the basis of what Catherine said, this quote unquote history mystery, and the research journey that I've been on for the past 6 months. So let's take a look at those 2 ads. They're right here on either side. So on the right, we have an ad published in the Maryland Gazette in 1759. And I would like to also say that these both list a man named Francis Irwin, an runaway Irish convict servant. So the one on the right is from the Maryland Gazette in 1759, and then the other one was published in 1775 through the Virginia Gazette. The description of Irwin in each are so similar that I could not let it go. Anyone who is interested in genealogy knows that you can't make assumptions. Just because they have the same name and the same occupation doesn't mean that they're the same person. And I knew this, I know it, and other people told me this, but I just couldn't let it go. I thought for sure these had to be describing the same man, even though they were published 16 years apart, and Irwin was escaping from 2 different locations. So let's look deeper into each ad. The first one we have here is the 1775 Virginia Gazette advertisement. It was posted by Samuel Canby, a Quaker merchant and mill owner who resided in Loudoun County, Virginia. And I'm going to read the first few sentences of this ad. So $50 reward, runaway from subscriber in Loudoun on the 14th of May. 2 Irish convict servants, viz. Francis Irwin, a stout fellow, about 5 feet 9 or 10 inches high, with a sandy complexion, short curled hair, thin visage, and gray eyes. He has 2 large upper teeth before a remarkable hoarse voice, and is by trade a blacksmith. Michael Lane, lately from Ireland, is about 5 feet 9 or 10 inches high, with a dark complexion, short dark hair, and black eyes. Okay. The ad then goes on to detail all the materials that Irwin and Michael Lane stole for their journey. It's quite a bit, including 2 horses. And as I mentioned before, these ads needed to be highly detailed. So we get a lot of information not only on his appearance, but his nationality and occupation. So a couple things to note from this ad. First, in addition to his physical appearance, Irwin is described as having a remarkable hoarse voice. This descriptor is not uncommon in runaway ads of this time period, but it was important enough for Canby to mention about Irwin. 2, Irwin runs away with a companion named Michael Lane, who is described as, quote unquote, lately from Ireland. Canby does not say that about Irwin. So this suggests he was in the colonies for a while. This ad was posted. Okay. So let's look at the second ad here. So the Maryland Gazette ad was posted in 1759 by our man, George Plater, who, as most of you know, was the owner of Sotterley in the 18th century. He was a wealthy and influential landowner located in St. Mary's County, Maryland. So I will be reading the first few sentences of this ad. So again, ran away from the subscriber in St. Mary's County on the 18th of February last, an Irish convict servant man named Francis Irwin, a sly, well-made, actually I can't quite see it because my face is in the way, sly, insinuating fellow, thank you, about 6 feet high, discovers his country by his tongue. He has a large scar in his throat and a wheezing in his speech. It is supposed he will endeavor to pass as one Stephen Stifford, having stole his indentures with a discharge thereon. He is a blacksmith by trade. Okay, so again, surface level, just by looking at these two ads, my genealogist training is saying, okay, there's not enough evidence to say that Francis Irwin from 1759 is the same Irwin from 1775, even though initially I wanted to make that leap. But let's look at the similarities from these two ads that were too hard for me to ignore. So again, he is described as having a large scar across his throat and a wheezing in his speech. It's kind of similar to hoarseness. He is also Irish, a blacksmith, and a convict servant. Also, he ran away with an Irish companion, as you can see down at the bottom of the ad, Peter Turley, who was an Irishman, and he stole a horse and clothing. So very similar ways of running away. Now, this is kind of standard with different similarities between runaways of that were indentured or convict servants. But again, it shows kind of a similar personality between the two. Okay. You guys might have caught this, but I established earlier in the slides that convict terms were usually between 7 to 14 years. Now, this is a 16-year gap. So we will explore that later on. I'm not ignoring it. So just to be continued. All right. So we've looked at the two ads. Let's ask our first research question of this journey we're on. Where was Francis Irwin convicted and sentenced for transportation? Now, we know from both ads, Irwin is described as Irish. As an Irishman, there is a higher chance that he was convicted in Ireland. Unfortunately, there are very few surviving records for Irish prisoners transported to America before 1788. So as someone who's trying to find him, right, where do I go to look for this information? So besides the runaway ads, I was not able to find any helpful or additional information using the resources I showed a few slides ago. I mean, I found helpful information, but not particularly on Francis, right? So the next best thing for me to do was to look through newspapers from an online resource called the British Newspaper Archive. And here is the front web page from a couple days ago. So this is kind of what it looks like still. This database holds 18th century publications from Scotland, Ireland, Wales, and England. I used a keyword search to look across the issues published. I gave myself a healthy year range between 1745 until 1773 to see if anything of interest popped up. And guess what? It did. So what I found was that Irwin wasn't convicted in Ireland, but across the sea in Chester, England. So you can see Ireland's right here, and we're right here in Chester, right next to Liverpool and Manchester, and on the border of Wales. Okay, the ad was published in the Chester Courant on May 27th, 1755. And this outlines his crime. Okay, so it says one Francis Irwin, an Irishman by trade a whitesmith, was committed to Northgate in the city for entering the dwelling of Edward Dickman, a shoemaker near High Cross, and he carries away a large box out of the chamber where the said shoemaker and wife were in bed. And he broke open the box and took out a bunch of money. And unfortunately, the money was found in his custody. And after a long examination, he confessed to the robbery. So, yes. He later on in the next month was, actually, let me go back real quick here. All right. So from this article, we can see that this is a Francis Irwin. Francis Irwin is a very common name, so I'm not expecting it to be the same person just yet, but here's some hopeful clues. One, he is an Irishman, but his trade is labeled as a whitesmith. So for those who don't know, a whitesmith is another word for a tinsmith or someone who works with light metals like silver. It was a skilled trade, and those who were in the profession could also do heavier work like blacksmithing. The other thing I want to note is that Northgate is the name of the prison within Chester City. Okay, next slide. A few weeks later, we find that Francis Irwin is ordered to be transported for 7 years along with two other men, John Holbrook and James Capper. And they were sentenced at the quarter sessions, and Chester City is within the county of Cheshire. So it was the Cheshire Quarter Sessions, which is essentially like their county court system. Okay, so we know that we have these details here: Irishman committed to Northgate, whitesmith, Cheshire Quarter Sessions, and then of course he was ordered for transportation for 7 years. All right, so now that we know he was sentenced through the quarter sessions, we can look to see if there's any additional information to be found within the local archives. Luckily, the Cheshire Archives has a fantastic, oh, I love it so much, a fantastic online catalog that include itemized details of their records within the quarter sessions collection, which I utilized, and it brought me this lovely transportation bond. So I do have the catalog record shown up there, so you can just see the series and the item level of these transportation bonds. And just by searching his name, I got really lucky. I found the transportation bond that I needed. Okay, so a little background: Francis and his fellow felons had to wait in a jail for a Crown-sanctioned merchant to take out a bond, so basically financial security, to ensure the convict's passage to, quote, His Majesty's plantations or colonies in America, and procure a certificate from the governor or chief custom officer as proof. This transportation bond was made out for Francis Irwin and James Capper, and you can see here that John Holbrook's name was scratched out. Okay. The bond was paid by a Liverpool merchant named James Gildhart to, quote, do and shall, as soon as conveniently may go, effectually transport or cause to be transport to the said Francis Irwin and James Capper. Right? So we can see my head's blocking it a little bit, but James Gildhart here signed this bond. It's listed for him. John Holbrook's name is scratched out. And essentially, this is the bond that shows that James Gildhart will take them out of jail and take them over to the colonies. Unfortunately for Irwin and Capper, they didn't leave the jail right after that bond was signed. So the bond was signed in August of 1755, so a few months after the indictment. But they were, I estimate, were in that jail for about 10 months. Now, with the help of the amazing staff at the Cheshire Archives, I was able to determine that, again, that they were still inmates by October 1755 using the jail indentures, which were essentially prison lists. And unfortunately, the records for 1756 were destroyed, but I'll show you a little later on why I think they were there for about 10 months. So the conditions at Northgate, that jail in Chester, weren't as bad as some of the other larger prisons like the infamous Newgate down in London. They were able to get fresh air in the yard. However, according to a 1787 account, inmates of the jail had shackles around their necks, hands, waist, and feet, and were attached to the floors or beds, depending on the time of day. So this is where I think that Francis might have gotten his scar across his neck. Okay, so this leads me to the next research question. Where did James Guildhart send Francis Irwin and James Capper? Now, James Guildhart, again, Liverpool merchant, he was the son of Richard Guildhart of Richard Guildhart and Sons. They were very prolific throughout the Chesapeake Bay and deeply involved in the transatlantic trade. His influence could be felt up and down the Chesapeake. His father had a base in Oxford, Maryland, which, excuse me, I'm a Virginia girl, so I'm not exactly sure where Oxford is, but I believe it's somewhere over here. And he and his family not only traded in English goods and convict servants, but also transported captive Africans to the British colonies. Now, if we take a look back at this 1759 ad from the Maryland Gazette, we can see that, again, the ad was placed by George Plater, who eventually became the 6th governor of Maryland and called Sotterley his home. Again, as most of you know, Sotterley was well positioned off the Patuxent River in St. Mary's County, Maryland, which is right there. They traded in tobacco, corn, and lumber in exchange for goods from Europe, which included, again, convicts and captive Africans. Based off of all of the context clues, it is most likely that Guildhart's ships sailed Francis to the port of Patuxent. Okay. So once I have that knowledge, I'm using the Maryland State Archives, and I come across this 500-page PDF file that was for free, and you can find it on their online catalog, that is of their Maryland Port of Entry books that cover this time period. Okay. Looking at these Port of Entry books, they reveal that Guildhart owned 2 vessels that went to the port of Patuxent in 1755 and 1756. The ships were called the Patuxent and the Lloyd. Now, Irwin wouldn't have been on either of these vessels in 1755 because they were already docked in Maryland while he was being convicted of his felony. So it is my belief that he was taken out of Liverpool by late March 1756. As you can see from this article here, they were, that's detailed from the Manchester Mercury, detailing both vessels leaving for Maryland. Okay. Now, after searching all 500 pages, I'm dedicated. It was the very last entry on the very last page that yielded the results I wanted. So you can see here we have this port of entry for the port of Patuxent, midsummer quarter 1756. And on July 31st of that year, the ship Patuxent, captained by Philip Cooley and owned by James Guildhart and Francis Lowndes of Liverpool, were carrying sundry European goods and 2 convicted felons for 7 years. So with this information, by the way, I was very excited when I found this. With this information, you can kind of see, for me, there's enough evidence to kind of draw a line between the 1755 conviction and to the 1759 runaway attempt published in the Maryland Gazette. Okay, so Francis makes it to Sotterley. And part of the reason why I reached out to our friends here at Sotterley was to see if there's any information I could find. And unfortunately, there are no papers at Historic Sotterley to give me a clue to what Francis was up to at the plantation. And as someone who works at a library and deals with this all the time, you know, as the farther you go back into history, the harder it is to find resources. So I'm not upset. It just means I have to look at it a different angle, right? You never give up. So also any relevant records, including St. Mary's courthouse documents, were either burned by fire or lost by time. So I can only speculate at this point what his life might have been like. But early American scholars say that blacksmithing on plantations usually consisted of repairing farm tools and making replacements for worn out parts. They could also be hired out to make shackles for prisons or maintain arms for the county. Irwin could have also had, and as we know from the England articles, that he probably had a broad skill set that might have included horse farrieing, which also would have been useful on a plantation. So as I mentioned at the start of this presentation, convict servants had very little rights, which could leave them to very depressed circumstances. So, you know, I think if we look back at I think I can go back. Oh, no, it's going to be too far. If we look back at that Maryland Gazette, the clothing he was described as wearing is better. If you look at it, the types of clothing is a little bit better than what you would find with other convict servants. So again, only speculation, but he might have been treated better at Sotterley than other places. But the fact that he ran away gives you a clue that things might have been a little bit hard for him there. Okay, so what happens in the 16 years between these two ads? Oh, here we go. Here's the ad. So it says that he has a dark brown bob wig, light colored duffel coat with flat metal buttons, you know, waistcoat and breeches. It's definitely better than what he was wearing in Loudon. Which is more homespun clothing. All right, so again, what's happening in the 16 years between these two ads? We still have that large gap. So Francis might have successfully escaped bondage from George Plater, but despite the large gap of time, the description from the 1775 ad listing him as a convict servant suggests that he was recaptured. Okay, so again, I'm asking myself, how the heck if this is the same guy, how does he end up in Loudoun County? And then what evidence points to Francis Irwin being the same runaway convict servant featured in the two ads? Okay, so this is for me, I'm looking at any sources I can to try and answer this question. So for me, I'm going to look at the laws that were there for the time. And Maryland and Virginia's laws for runaways were fairly similar, so I am going to conflate the two. If you want to look deeper into specific laws, I definitely recommend you do that. But we can see that they both required runaways to serve double the time they were absent from their duties. So if you can look at this quote here at the top, if we run away and are taken again, for every hour's absence, we must serve 24. For a day, a week, for a week, a month, for a month, a year. And if we steal or commit murder, death is the immediate reward for such actions. Now, this came from William Green, who was a Maryland convict servant in the 1760s, and he eventually made it back to England and published his account. Okay, so in addition to having doubled their time when they ran away, tacked on to their term, they also had to pay off the amount their quote unquote master paid to get them back. So there were laws required for the, again, quote unquote master to, I lost my track of thought, but again, they had to basically pay the people that helped them recapture those convicts. So these two things could easily tack on more time to their convict term. I have seen it for the Australian convicts that when there was a person that was running away so much that his term easily turned into 20 years. So, you know, there's also other punishments that we have here, the being placed in irons or jailed, hair cut close and above the ears, branded with an R, and given lashes. And the reason why I don't think Francis was ever executed is because his skill as a blacksmith saved him from that fate. He was an economic resource, and it was better to just tack on more time to his service than execute him. Okay. So we've established that it was possible for Francis Irwin to turn a 7-year term into a 20-year sentence. We will revisit how I think he made it over to Loudoun later in the presentation. So here we are. This is Loudoun County. So we're fast forwarding about 16 years here. So we're going to we're going to refocus on our quote unquote history mystery. We're back to this 1775 ad. Samuel Canby, our Quaker merchant and mill owner, published this ad in June. And it says that Francis Irwin and Michael Lane both fled Loudoun County in early May. Unlike St. Mary's County in Maryland, the courthouse at Loudoun is fortunate to have a nearly complete record of documents since its founding in 1757. So this means I can create a clear picture of Irwin's time there. And it also helps that I worked at the history library that's really right next to the courthouse. So I do have that advantage. So looking at some of the court records, there are multiple entries from the court order books that are similar to court minutes that show Irwin had not only one quote unquote master, but two while he was in Virginia. It also seems that Francis was running any chance he could get. The first two entries show him running from a Thomas West, who was a Loudoun landowner, and he ran from him twice in 1773. And then in 1774, he doesn't show up to court. And Samuel Canby is waiting there with Stephen Donaldson. All right. So this man just doesn't want to appear. Now, okay, so we have here that it's the 1773 and 1774. That's 2 years prior to 1775, that runaway ad. This narrows our 16-year gap to 14 years. So based off of the court records, we know he ran twice in 1773. And luckily, I found another runaway advertisement that was published in the Pennsylvania Gazette for one of those runaway attempts in 1773. So this was posted in November by Thomas West. And West's description of Irwin is not flattering at all. So it's about 5 feet 8 inches high, a chunky fellow, short black hair, speaks in his throat as if he has a very bad cold, and has a scar on his throat. And when out of breath, wheezes. Okay, so this ad made me so happy and very excited. It's so close to the 1759 ad that I would find it very hard to believe that there were two Francis Irwins who were blacksmiths, Irish, with a scar across their throat and a penchant for stealing, living within the same era. So for me, it's too much of a coincidence. Okay, so again, this is kind of the connecting, and it's making me think a little bit closer to the fact that these guys are the same person. So this is the same Francis Irwin. Here, again, I'm utilizing those court records. My friends over at the courthouse sent me this loose paper file. It is an account that Thomas West exhibited. You can see that the costs were tallied up for a 22 absent days absence here, and it was paid out to the men that helped Thomas recapture Francis. So we have their neighbor, his neighbor, John Hall, and Thomas's brother, Charles West here. Okay. Now, okay, so we know that Thomas West originally held Irwin in bondage in Loudoun County first, and we know that eventually Irwin was passed off to Samuel Canby by 1774. Again, is there any links that we can gather between Canby and West besides the evidence we have already? Okay, so a little background on Thomas West. His family was very influential in Northern Virginia. His brother and father owned an ordinary on a main thoroughfare called Colchester. George Washington wrote in his diary of staying at that ordinary during the French and Indian War. And Thomas himself inherited 300 acres and owned 16 horses at the time of his death in 1777. So I looked at his estate, his probate records to get that information. And ordinaries, they're like a tavern or inn, usually maintained a stable and had a blacksmith's forge. Okay. If we look at Samuel Canby, he was also deeply involved in Loudoun's economy. He had 113 acres along the North Fork of Goose Creek, which, if you can see here, is right on this area below the town of Purcellville. And he had a lease-release agreement for 2 lots in the town of Leesburg, and I have his 2 lots starred here. So this is an early 18th century plan of Leesburg plotted out. Again, also thanks to my friends over at the Loudoun County Courthouse. Now, 2 doors down from Canby is a man named Craven Peyton, who also owns a lot. I mention him because Craven Peyton happens to be Thomas West's brother-in-law. So the reason why I bring this up, it's the connections, the common neighbors and associates, however loose, help to show the economic connections between the upper class members of Loudoun County. You know, they are working together, trading together, leasing out. There were enslaved individuals in Loudoun County, so leasing out their enslaved individuals or, selling an indenture to another person. So Francis could have easily been passed over from Thomas to Samuel Canby at this point. Okay, so surprise, surprise, he runs away again in 1774. So this is another runaway ad that I found. He doesn't steal a horse this time, but once again, he either took or forged an indenture or pass under the name of Peter Diglin. The other thing to note about this ad is that Canby mentions Irwin pretends to be a whitesmith, which I find is an interesting comment. It might be a possible nod to Irwin's time in England. Okay. Now, this leads us back to our 1775 ad. And guess what? This is his success story. He finally is successful in running away. Canby runs this ad 9 times in the Virginia Gazette, which it was like over a 3-month period. Other than that evidence alone, how do I know Irwin and Lane were successful? Well, I only really know that Irwin was successful because if we look at the bolded section I have here, Canby suspects them to run towards New York or Boston. Runaway servants of any type could easily blend in at any city within colonial America, and Irwin's skill set would have been useful anywhere, especially because this is 1775. We're readying for a full-out war with England. I would also like to note that Irwin's position as a blacksmith might have given him more opportunity and means to run than other servants, and especially enslaved individuals looking to self-emancipate. participate. He obviously had access to horses and clothing, and had probably had more contact with individuals that were outside of his household. So it just gave him more means to make that leap and run away, and blend in bigger cities, possibly. So did I find him in New York or Boston? No, he does not make it that far. His city of choice is Baltimore. And how I found him was, once again, our guy Francis is running away. This time he's running away from a gunsmith named Samuel Messersmith in Baltimore. And this physical description here that we have is almost identical to how Canby described him in the 74 and 75 ads. If his alias hadn't been blown, or if Samuel didn't know Francis's, original name, I probably wouldn't have been able to find this ad. So I also like to point out that Samuel Messersmith calls him an Irish servant man. He's not a convict servant. He's just a regular servant man. And he's also listed as a horse farrier, showing off that broad range of skills. Okay. So hopefully you got that money. My thought is that he probably ran away because his alias was blown, but I don't know exactly why he ran in this particular instance. Okay. All right. So this is the last we see of our guy, Francis Irwin, for now. I'm not done with this history mystery. I have a strong case to think that this is the same man, but I really do want to try and fill in that 14-year gap of Irwin's story. Okay. And like I mentioned before, this has only been 6 months of my life. So, there's plenty of time. The research is not done. I'm looking to see if I can make that leap. Okay. So, like the connection I showed between Thomas West and Samuel Canby, I'd like to do the same with George Plater by using a common genealogical methodology called the fan club. It's a term that means that I will be looking into the records of George's family, associates, and neighbors to see if I can find the missing links. So if I don't have enough information that directly relate to George Plater, looking at his family, associates, and neighbors, maybe there's something that I can find that will help me get past the brick wall that I'm at currently. Okay, so I have a few examples here underneath this fan club. I wanted to bring up George Washington as an example. Washington, and hopefully this makes sense. He's like the quote unquote Kevin Bacon of the 18th century. He is literally connected to everybody, or there's like a 6 degrees of separation from him. He was acquainted with George Plater. He did business with our Liverpool merchant James Guildhart, and as I mentioned before, he stopped by the West Ordinary in Loudoun County during the French and Indian War. He also wrote to Thomas West's brother, Charles, about a piece of land in Fairfax, which is the bordering county to Loudoun, in 1769. Now, do I think I'll find anything related to Francis by looking at Washington? No, probably not, but it is fun. But this is an easy example to show how the economic ties between the Maryland Tidewater and Northern Virginia existed during this 18th century period. And I will be picking the brains of our Sotterley friends here to see if I can find other avenues for George Plater. But the other one I wanted to mention that was possible associate and neighbor, but definitely a neighbor of George Plater, was Thompson Mason. Now, Thompson Mason was the brother to the founding father, George Mason of Fairfax. Thompson's wife was related to George Plater's wife through her half-brothers, who happened to be Mrs. Plater's first cousin. So believe me, that took me forever to figure out. So if you need me to repeat what that connection is, just let me know at the end of this presentation. But essentially, they were loosely connected through marriage and through the first cousins. Now, Thompson's father-in-law was Abraham Barnes, who lived in what is now known as Tudor Hall, and the home to St. Mary's County Historical Society, which is about a 20-minute drive from historic Sotterley. Barnes was a merchant himself, and he and Thompson Mason had dealings with Guildhart before the Revolution. And the one thing I would like to note is that Thompson moved to Loudoun County by 1770 and set up his family seat called Raspberry Plain. So again, there's these ties from St. Mary's County to Loudoun County. One of the larger connections is that the fact that George Plater was a large landowner himself and inherited a lot of land from his father, including a parcel that was carved from Brightwell's hunting quarter and also known as Sugarland. So this parcel is situated between Broad Run, we'll go here so we can see it. Broad Run is up here, and Seneca Creeks. And the Potomac River is bordering right here, or dividing this parcel of land. I don't know exactly where it is, but somewhere around here. And it is right across the Potomac to Loudoun County, as you can see where I put that star. Okay, so these threads will I will continue to pull these threads. This parcel is now in what is today Montgomery County, Maryland. But when George Plater owned the land, it was known as Frederick County, Maryland, which is only 45-minute drive from me. So I'll be visiting our friends up in Frederick to see if I can find any local records. I'll be pestering the Maryland State Archives again. But I really would like to try and flesh out his theory. And hopefully, as you could tell from this presentation, there's so much to learn about convict servitude just from this one man named Francis Irwin. I still don't know anything about his date of birth or his death dates, his religion. But what I do know is that Francis was an industrious man, highly skilled at his craft, and would not stay tied down in servitude or remain in bondage. His skill saved him from being executed, since he was enough of an economic asset to keep in bondage long-term rather than be killed. And so for me, I really hope he eventually makes it back to Ireland, or, escapes to become his own man. All right. I include some of the repositories I used while I was making this search. You can see these. If you'd like to see the sources I used in detail, or play around with the online newspaper databases I used, feel free to scan the QR code that's right here, or visit Thomas Balch Library's website and click the digital exhibits tab for the story map. So thank you so much for having me.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for this. I have to laugh. I never thought of George Washington as the Kevin Bacon of the 18th century. I'm going to never forget that, now that little earworm is in my head.
We had a great time saying that at the library. We were giggling about him being the Kevin Bacon. So I'm glad you like that.
No, I like that one. Catherine, I may let you go ahead and handle the questions. We do have some questions in the chat, but I do want to just give a shout out. There are people joining us tonight, of course, from all over Maryland, but we've got Idaho, California, North Carolina, Virginia, Pennsylvania, Arizona, and that's just people who told me. So there are a lot of history geeks out there, and we embrace and love you all. And we actually have some descendants on this as well, which is wonderful. And I did notice our first question is from our dear friend Rosamond in North Carolina. So Catherine, would you like to go ahead and give her that question?
Absolutely. I also want to give a shout out to the members of our interpretive team who are also deeply invested in researching the Plater fan club. Rose actually has a really good question. She is researching the background of a woman who was murdered aboard the Charity of London en route to St. Mary's County in 1654. Oh, wow. And she's had no luck sourcing the ship Manifest. Even looking at the ship, the Lloyd's registry has turned up nothing. Do you have any recommendations for archives or libraries that she should check out?
So, yeah, that is one of the things that I also ran into some issues. Like I said, Peter Coldham Wilson took a lot of that off our plates by having that large index. It doesn't cover everything, but it's always a great place to start, and especially to read the beginning of that book, because he outlines which art repositories he's delving into, which might give you a segue. I also looked at the British National Archives. They have a great catalog. The only thing for me with that is I asked them if they could look at, they have some records that are coming out of Liverpool that are exiting, I'm not saying the right term, but basically ships leaving Liverpool. And I asked for a very specific sliver of time, and they wanted to charge me $400 or £400 to look through that. So there is some money that you just have to be careful. But yeah, hopefully that answers your question.
And we have an example of that here at Sotterley with our research with the ship, the Generous Jenny. We had to contact the archives in the UK at Kew, and we did have to pay for that information. And so Nancy and I remember those days of if you want that information, they will charge you for it.
Yeah. Oh, well, and the one thing I will add is that it depends by repository too. Like I said, I really loved the Cheshire Archives. They did charge me, but it was a reasonable amount that I was willing to pay because I really wanted to know, so it is a case by case basis.
We had another really good question from Joseph. He's asking, have you tried looking at German language newspapers for runaway ads on convict servants?
No, I haven't. That is a great suggestion. Again, this has only been 6 months for me. And if you look at my story map, I do outline the newspaper databases I use, but I'm primarily focusing on English speaking ones. So yeah, that's great. Thank you for that tip.
Madison Russell is asking, is this going to be published? Are you going to make this a pamphlet, or is this a part of a paper? What's the end goal?
Yeah, so Maddie Russell was a former coworker of mine, so she's teasing me here. To be determined. Like I said, I want to get more information with that 14-year gap. So if I can find more information, I would certainly consider publishing an article about this. Yeah.
And Rose brought up a really good point, which is an exhibit on this at Sotterley would be awesome. I agree. Yeah. I can tell you his story is going to be incorporated into our tour script for the guided tours, highlighting the convict servants that are another part of the people who lived and labored at Sotterley over centuries.
Yeah.
I did have a question for you in thinking, obviously somebody in England decides I'm going to pay to get them over there and somebody's going to pay me for them once I get there. Correct. Mm-hmm. That's how it works. Yeah. But is there a type of crime that they will ship you over for? And is there a level that they're saying we're not going to? Like what is the range of crimes that you would do that for?
That's a great question. So I haven't looked quite in detail on what that line is. I know that they had a crowding issue and wanted to get these people out of the prisons, and didn't want execution as their only mode of getting rid of the population. But they would range. I mean, there would be very, very petty crimes, and usually the bigger the crime, if it was like murder or whatever, it could still end up in execution. But for whatever reason, if they get saved from that particular fate, then they would get that larger sentence of 14 years rather than it being the 7-year sentence. So usually they would just tack on more time. And the other thing I'd mention is that bond that the merchants would pay was more of like that financial security bond that would just basically, it was like held. And then by the time that they procured that evidence that they were over in the colonies, that bond would be released. Or their money would be recouped. So it was a temporary hold. Yeah.
Gotcha. You mentioned the port of the Patuxent, and honestly, I don't know. Catherine, do you know what that refers to? Because I haven't heard that term before. I don't know where that landing space is. So to our researchers out there, you have to help us figure out, because if it says it's port of the Patuxent, I'm not quite sure where that would be.
And I don't know either. Obviously, my main focus is Virginia, but it is the port of entry in that 500 PDF document. It's not just for the port of Patuxent. It was also Potomac and other areas throughout the Maryland, Chesapeake area. I don't know for sure where that port was. I know that George Plater's father was, I forget the term, but he was basically like in charge of the port. It must have been close by but I don't know where that landing port would have been. Yeah.
Yeah, so there is a title that George Plater II has with the Patuxent and kind of collecting of taxes and things like that. There's also a kind of an established familiarity with the Guildhart family in terms of the Patuxent. James's father, Richard, through research that we've done, there is a connection between Richard and the first owner of Sotterley, James Bowles. And so this is a long-standing relationship. James Bowles' family were listed as like merchants and involved in the trade going back to Chester and Liverpool in England.
Okay, very cool.
Ms. Catherine, I think we've got another question from Brent.
Yes. Let me go over to the Q&A then. Do we have any idea what the relationships would have been like between indentured servants, convict servants, and enslaved at this time?
That is a great question. I do know that the laws eventually developed to where they were really trying to limit enslaved individuals from running with either indentured or convict servants. I can't remember what the penalty was, but it was a pretty severe penalty. So you don't really see indentured or enslaved individuals running together. And that's the only way I've actually seen that relationship that in my research. That's a great question that would be awesome to get answered. Do you guys have any thoughts?
There's a story in St. Mary's County going back to the time of Lord Baltimore with a woman who was a woman of Irish origin who was an indentured servant. Her name was Eleanor or Nell, and she marries an enslaved man, Charles, and later generations of that family will have some of the earliest court cases in Maryland for the pursuit of freedom and being freed from slavery, as the fact that Nell was free and of European descent. And so there is this very early interaction that we know of, more than one circumstance in Maryland, but we do know that pretty much the laws in the Tidewater region do change and become more and more strict as time goes on.
Yeah. The other thing I'll note that's kind of off on a tangent a little bit is that through line for a lot of these runaway ads for Francis Irwin is that he always chooses an Irishman or someone of Irish descent to run with. And in the 1759, it says that he speaks, it says that he essentially has a heavy accent. So, language comes into play and those common backgrounds come into play. The companion he runs away with in 1759, Peter Turley, I actually tracked him a couple years later. He got jailed in York, Pennsylvania, and staged a breakout from that jail with like 3 other Irish people of varying like convict servants or free Irishmen. So it's just really interesting, that community dynamic between those who are of the servitude or bondage class in this time period. So.
Ms. Catherine, do you have any other questions? And she's not joking. This is going to be included in this year's tour. So you all tonight are the first people to hear about this, because this is going to be going in our tour. Catherine, did you have any questions or comments you wanted to add?
I think the comment is that this is a really great example of a story that isn't always highlighted in guided tours or in research, but it's a fascinating one because the story of the convict servants who were brought here is a part of the story of what shapes the development of the Tidewater region of the United States. But it's an often overlooked one, and we are going to again keep pushing forward to learn more about Francis Irwin and other convict servants, and hopefully work to include more of that story in our tours.
I loved a comment from a former trustee, Meredith Taylor, who her comment was, very interesting and excellent example of careful, dedicated research. Thank you. What a character Francis was. A career criminal we want to root for.
Right. I love it.
Thank you, Meredith, for that. That is, you just got to give him tenacity there. He keeps doing it. He keeps stealing horses. He keeps going. But I do think in his case, probably the harshness was not there as the same way as if he had been an enslaved person. So there's that to note. But we will root for finding out more information, and maybe there was something that happened to him up north that you'll find out, and we'll just add to the story. So that will be
yeah. Thanks for that comment. That's great. My coworkers and I have had a great time with Francis and coming up with different titles like he can run, but he can't hide. Anna's on the trail, So we've been having a lot of fun with this. So,
well, we are so grateful for you to come and share this with us tonight. It is so wonderful to find new bits of information. As Catherine says, we are finding out new information all the time. There is such a richness of history that belongs to here and to all of us, and the interweaving of all the stories really helped to shape, as Catherine said, what shaped this region and really what shaped this nation. And it's all those pieces together. So thank you for giving us another piece of the puzzle. We really appreciate it. And to all of you who joined us tonight, we've got more coming this season. The next one will be in person. It's going to be, if you are interested in amphibians and the Eastern Hellbender, we hope that you will come and join us to find out more in April. We will be doing that in person. There are other things that are going on in April. If you've got kids, bring them here for spring break week. Catherine has got all kinds of fabulous things planned with other partners, so we're really excited about that. We'll have a bird walk, and there is nothing better than our Garden Guild's plant sale at the end of April. So there's a lot of stuff coming. And this day, it was making us all think of spring anyway, wasn't it? If I know it was going to be this nice, we would have had you here in person. We thought it could be snowing. You never know this time of year. Yeah. But to all of you, thank you for joining us. Thank you for being part of our journey as we continue learning here at Historic Sotterley. And I hope you all have a great rest of your evening. Good night, everybody.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you.